Hey guys, I know I haven't posted in a while and I left you guys off with my Chongyun energy recharge calculator. Sorry again as I have been busy with some IRL stuff. And so yeah, I'd also like to start off and say thank you for all of your responses to the poll I put out a couple days ago in the Chongyun mains Discord and also in our Reddit. And so thank you to the 192 people who voted. Now, you may be wondering about the title of this video. Hey, this is not a shattered video. What's the deal? Well, I'd like to point out that although I did say I would be focusing on these topics, I'd like to first discuss Chongyun's viability in general. So here is a look at Razor's values. We have 113 to 187% skill multiplier for his basic attacks, and 278 skill multiplier for his burst on a 5-second cooldown. This is note tapping E. And to put that into perspective, Chongyun's basic attacks go from 91.75% to 147.13, while his multiplier for his elemental skill is 240.86 on a 15-second cooldown. Based on that, we can see the difference between an ideal DPS, aka Razor, aka lowest S tier character, versus Chongyun, an A tier character, arguably B tier in certain scenarios and team compositions. Now you may be wondering, hey Shadow, why are you making Chongyun look so bad? Or even, don't compare our Popsicle to another character. Well, don't worry, I've come to research Chongyun, well aware of his limitations as a character, and have exhausted almost all possibilities in terms of making him viable. This is what I want to direct your attention to, the idea of melt. Most people who play Chongyun enjoy running a shatter team composition, where Chongyun shatters a frozen enemy, dealing additional physical damage to scales of elemental mastery, character level, and enemy resistance. This is one of the many transformative reactions and has considerable base damage when we look at the graphs of base damage of transformative reactions, coming in second, excluding double proc electrocharge. However, shattered has its limits due to the frequency at which we can perform the reaction. In order for Chongyun to perform a shattered reaction, he must freeze the enemy with one hit and shatter the enemy with another. That is equivalent to 2 hits used in his 4 basic attack combo. Moreover, there is an internal cooldown or ICD on all skills that apply an element on an enemy. We can easily observe this through Chongyun hitting an Nemo Hypostasis or any mob that carries an innate elemental aura, where all his basic attacks do not create a reaction. Note, reactions have no cooldown. It is the cooldown on his elemental skill or infused basic attacks. And that's why the cooldown is within the character of Chongyun. Now, this is because infused auto attacks is considered as one source of cryo. Other sources include his E and his A4 talent, and each of his elemental burst icicles that drop down has their own source of cryo. Now, I'll give you guys some time to internalize that. So to conclude that statement, since his E, A4 passive, and Q act as its own source, those are skills that can freeze enemies regardless of ICD because they have done, or their ICD is based on their own cooldown. However, the shattered reaction will only do a fixed amount of damage and can't critical hit. Meanwhile, another form of reaction is multiplicative reactions, which include melt and vaporize. Now, for those uneducated players who argue melt is just 150% damage amplification, and yes, that is true. However, since his E, A4 passive, and Q for each icicle act as its own cryo source, they are not dependent on internal cooldowns of his infused auto attacks. Then, melt suddenly becomes a viable team composition to run. This is because for each source of cryo, we can apply a melt reaction. And as I said it before, each reaction doesn't have a cooldown. Therefore, you can proc multiple melts in a short amount of time. So, an example would be if I hit 1000 with my E skill on a pyro target causing me to do melt for 150%, the melt damage would be 1500, assuming that energy elemental mastery is 0. So if that E skill crits with 100% critical damage, that would cause your damage to go to 3000. Effectively, a 3 times multiplier to your damage. Okay, so now you may be wondering, well, if we can do that damage, how would we actually perform it? Isn't it easier to apply Pyro on Cryo than Cryo on Pyro? So TLDR of that is, his E increases the frequency of Cryo auto attacks than Pyro. Well, you're right there, but in here, I have listed the attack pattern you must perform in order for Chongyun MainDPS in a melt comp to work. Note, if you do plan on running a melt comp where Chongyun is MainDPS, you need a Bennett. I won't stress this enough, Bennett makes Chongyun melt viable. Without him, the argument of Chongyun being weird to play is true. Now, Bennett also provides really good synergies when you run him as a support 4-piece noblesse. Yeah. So here is the attack pattern based on testing I recommend, and we will be using this as reference for the rest of the video. So we first have Bennett E, followed by Chongyun E applies Cryo, which is a melt reaction. And due to the how reactions work, we have another melt with his basic attack. That's in hit 1. Then we have hit 2, hit 3, Bennett E. Hit 1, melt, hit 2, hit 3, hit 4, melt. Bennett E to apply Pyro again, hit 1, melt, hit 2, Rhymechester, melt. And hit 3, hit 4, both of which non-cryo, then 1 to 3, which is non-cryo. And this is over the span of 15 seconds. So, you may be wondering, why is there 2 consecutive melts in the beginning? Why are there 6 melts for 3 Bennett E's? Well, to answer your question, as we have discussed in a previous video regarding mechanics, if you apply strong Pyro Elemental Gauge on an enemy, you can essentially apply 2 or even up to 4 melt reactions depending on the rate at which you apply the Cryo. Note that this is the TLDR of it. If you want to skip the explanation behind that, I suggest skipping around the time marked on your screen. But if you want to listen to me discussing the mechanics behind it, which is really important, I suggest you stick around. Now that the normies have gone, so for multiplicative reactions, when doing a 1.5 times reaction, the first element applied can remain on the target. In general, those reactions will reduce a specific amount of duration, depending on if they have a strong or weak elemental gauge. A strong elemental gauge is referred to as a skill or attack that applies an element for around 12 seconds, while a weak elemental gauge is referred to as a skill or attack that applies an element for around 9 seconds. Refer to the diagram provided on the screen. Data here is taken from the Cutscene Mains Discord server, which was translated from CN testers and others. For 1.5 times reactions, which is Cryo on Pyro, when using a strong followed by a strong, the duration of the initial element is reduced by 7.5 seconds. An example of this would be Kea E on Bennett E. So 12 seconds minus 7.5 seconds, we have 4.5 seconds remaining of the Cryo element on the enemy. This means you can potentially cause up to 2 1.5 reactions in a row if there's still time remaining on the initial element. Now, in this case of Chongyun, when using a strong followed by a weak, the duration of the initial element is reduced by 3.7 seconds. This means you can potentially cause up to 3 or 4 if you apply 4 different weeks in less than 1 second, 1.5 reactions in a row this way. So if we base it off Bennett, his E skill sets gauge to 12 seconds. Each cryo hit from the Chongyun's elemental burst, or basically any cryo hit, will reduce that by 3.7 seconds. This is where we can proc multiple reactions because there is still a lingering pyro elemental aura on the enemy. This is shown on screen. Now, if we take this concept from earlier, you can apply this to its elemental burst. As we stated previously, each icicle acts as its own source and is able to create independent reactions. So if we do a little bit of math, 12 seconds minus 3.7 minus 3.7 minus 3.7 seconds again, that's 3 icicles. We have 0.9 seconds remaining of the elemental aura on the target, meaning C6 has a 0.9 second window to proc the 4th melt reaction with his extra Rhymechester blade. Now, the significance of this is that we can proc 3 melt reactions with our burst with strong pyro and 2 reactions if we're using a weak on weak, as it's reduced by 5.7 seconds. So if we were to return to Xiangling plus Chongyun, we can only do a maximum of 2 melts with Chongyun Q rather than 3 with Bennett E tap. So yeah, TLDR, 3 melts strong pyro, 2 melts weak pyro. Now going back to our attack pattern. This is tested really with no hit lag, meaning shields and other larger mobs could disrupt this combo. Also, I'd like to add, this is not an accurate representation of switches, but represents a general rule as different knockbacks and attacks may cause you to reposition. This is taken over a period of roughly 15 seconds. Note that we have explained the rotation and mechanics. Now we will look at the different builds Chongyun can do. For Bennett support, we want to run primarily energy recharge on our hourglass, energy recharge on our weapon, be it Favonius or sacrificial, and go pyro bonus damage, attack percent for his goblet, and or healing bonus to boost his heal on his circlet. His Q attack percent bonus scales off Bennett's basic attacks, so getting him as high leveled as possible with weapon leveled is a priority over leveling his artifacts. Artifact priority goes energy recharge first, followed by either damage or healing depending on what your team is lacking and your overall survivability. I recommend Bennett to be given more field time if you lack him post level 60 Ascension, for him to recharge his burst, and when you have his artifacts and talents leveled up, use him as a secondary DPS while in his ultimate after the Bennett Q plus Chongyun Q combo to take advantage of the cooldown reduction. Now, for Chongyun Melt main DPS, you want to run 4-piece Gladiators or 4-piece Lava Walkers to take advantage of the damage percent bonus being applied to Chongyun's elemental skill and elemental burst as well. Chongyun's strength lies in his elemental burst, which brings me to the conclusion that depending on if you can maintain your pyro aura on enemies, 4-piece Lava Walkers could potentially be better than Gladiators. However, this can be problematic as innate aura mobs may dispel the pyro aura, making this setup favor 4-piece Gladiators. You want to run your standard attack percent, cryo bonus damage percent, and crit rate or crit damage following the 1-to-2 ratio respectively. Now, at a min-max perspective, if you hit all criterias as previously stated, having around 180 to 200 elemental mastery is where the highest DPS or ideal based on testing done from the Kutzing Main's Discord server. Credit to Theory Crafter Hale. However, do take this with a grain of salt as it can vary depending on characters, and this was not tested specifically for Chongyun. In addition, this is also a ballpark value, so yeah, grain of salt. I also recommend bringing Descent Venerer support to Cryo Swirl and boost your Elemental Burst combo with Bennett. Now that we know the artifacts and what to run, let's move on to comboing your Elemental Burst. For the combo, we want to first apply Cryo with Chongyun's Infused Auto or E. Switch to Sucrose or Venti. Cryo Swirl that, which procs the VV. Switch to Bennett, presses Elemental Burst. Then once you press this Elemental Burst, you can also press your E if there's still a lingering Cryo before the Elemental Burst. Once you press your Elemental Burst, swap back to Chongyun and instantly perform his Elemental Burst. You can also weave in a Pyro Swirl if you have Sucrose for additional damage for that specific reaction. Here's a video provided by DaxDev, one of our members in our Chongyun mains community who arguably has one of the better builds on Chongyun. Note, the combo will be listed on screen. Now that you see the big numbers, let me point out, although Chongyun is treated as a main DPS in this scenario, he is nowhere near in terms of damage from his basic attacks compared to other carries, like I said before when comparing him with Razor. This is why treating Chongyun not as a main DPS, rather a sub DPS or burst DPS is what I would do once I fix up my Bennett. However, you can still run Chongyun as a main DPS as I've shown here, and so yeah. I'd like to add for Chongyun pure burst support, you want to run 4-piece Noblesse Oblige. For Chongyun burst DPS, which is like a mix, like I stated here, you want to run either a variation of 2-piece Gladiators or 2-piece Noblesse. And for Lava Walker and Chongyun as burst DPS is not the best and does less damage than the 2-piece Glads, 2-piece Noblesse Oblige set. And so, you only want to run Lava Walkers if you're running Melt MainDPS Chongyun. And again, I've stated previously the limitations of running Lava Walkers. Now, that concludes the video explaining the Melt. I will be putting out a video on a DPS calculator for this Melt specific build along with DPS calculator for Shattered so you can compare yourself to damage comparison. I'd like to end by saying thank you for sticking around the entire video, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking the video and subscribing, as I put a lot of effort creating these videos and for my research on Chongyun. Being one of the only Chongyun theory crafters / researchers does limit the extent of my data and research, as I am not an expert in certain aspects which include frame data and DPS analysis based on that. My methods are more simplistic based on T = seconds, so yeah. A like or comment would be greatly appreciated. Do check the comments for any updates. And video on DPS calculator coming soon, so yeah, stay tuned. Thank you.